on live television before an audience of several 100 million people across the world in the celebration of VE Day in Europe. I challenged them. They admitted they were wrong, but they called it an inaccuracy. And when pressed, they responded, oh, but we also covered so much else that was accurate, just like Hillary Clinton did in response to Benghazi. Rather than answer where the responsibility lay, who gave the order, she immediately will tell you, we have prevented, thousands of other attacks, and we have tens of thousands of dedicated workers, and will go on playing the part of someone who, of course, deserves to be Secretary of State because she's so adored by her workers. Chapter 6 is on the character of Abraham Lincoln and how, by the way, I hope you've seen the film, which is a magnificent one. This is an exception in which Hollywood really captured the truth in demonstrating how many pressures Lincoln was subject to and how all the time he strove to bind up the wounds of the nation, but he knew that he had tread on a legal minefield with the Emancipation Proclamation and that it would have to be ratified by an act of Congress and a constitutional amendment. 7, the religious left is as potent as the religious right. Most young people, when you talk about religion, they will immediately say, yeah, I'm against the Republicans because they have these evangelical types, and we all know religion always is on the side of the right, as if they were deaf, dumb, and blind during the last election, or in following the career of Barack Obama and his dependence on the many black, separatist, radical churches in inner Chicago, most infamous of all, the Reverend Wright, and one of the keynote speakers at the Democrat Convention in Charlotte, the nun, Sister Simone Campbell, if you heard her speech, as if any decent religious person would normally, of course, only be able to vote in one direction because religion calls upon us to love and help our neighbor, as if this is the image they have somehow in their interpretation of the Bible, as mistaken as it is. I'm sure some of you would like me to go into more detail on that, but let me finish reading the table of contents. 8, how freedom of religion is not an absolute right. During the debate on the establishment of the mega mosque that was planned at Ground Zero, Mayor Bloomberg and the whole liberal establishment and media attempted to portray anyone who objected to this as a bigot, imagining that the Constitution always guarantees total freedom of religion. Yes, as long as it's limited to beliefs and not actions that endanger the health, welfare of individual citizens or counteract and contradict accepted notions of morality. The federal government refused to accept the Mormon settlement of Utah unless they changed their covenant and prohibited plural marriage. Likewise, not only at the federal level, but at the state level, many states had to enact laws prohibiting the practice in the so-called serpent churches, where in certain rural areas in Appalachia, live serpents were handled by congregants, resulting in deaths and other injuries. That this Even though it's their religious belief, it results in a dangerous action, and of course, the government has a right to prevent it. If only we had intervened earlier, we could have prevented through government action the greatest loss of civilian life before 9/11, the death of over 850 people who were convinced to commit mass suicide in Guyana. Do you remember that? The temple, whatever, by the Reverend Jones. They all call themselves Reverend, but that is not a protection provided by the Constitution. The government has the right, and it certainly should have prevented this mosque and the people who wanted to foster it upon the people of New York. 9 had to do with a local election in 2010. It's titled The Stalinist and Daniel Webster, which is a play on the devil and Daniel Webster. And the Daniel Webster I refer to was not the 19th century congressman, but the present elected representative and his opponent, Alan. Okay, I didn't say it, but chapter 10, one that I'm personally involved in, the anachronistic American Jewish affection for the left. Why do so many Jews who are certainly well-off, educated, why they continue to support left-wing causes? And I know this from my own family. I grew up in what was one of maybe the most liberal district in the country, in the Melrose Morrisania section of the Bronx. And I point out that this Jewish misplaced affection is an anachronism that goes back to what they learned from their grandparents, but is certainly no longer valid today. So I point out that although Jewish liberalism is a disease which is inherited, but it is curable. In chapter 11, I look at collective versus individual rights. Our Constitution does not deal in any collectives, only with the rights of individuals. Yet not only the Democrats, but for many generations now, administrations have played with having a balance of how many people must be chosen from not a region, as was previously the case to balance a ticket, but to have the appropriate number of each religious or ethnic or racial group. So, unwittingly, every census demands now that people identify themselves by race. Yes. And in order to get a contract to work for the state of Florida, I was told I had to identify myself. Why? Why is this of any concern with the government? I'm an individual and I only want to be judged as an individual. All right, the next section deals with 6 or 7 chapters on Europe. And here too, I think this is important, even though you may have limited interest or knowledge, but many young people have seen hundreds of Hollywood films, and they grow up with the most absurd ideas. I've asked classes of mine, I taught both geography and a number of other subjects, English for foreigners, as well as what I'm teaching now, but in the courses on geography and in discussions, I ask students, can you identify who in Europe was most engaged in opposition to the expansion of Nazi Germany? And they might actually get a name like, oh yeah, it was Churchill in England. And then I ask, What political group was Churchill from? And they say, well, he must have been somewhere on the left. Churchill represented as far right as you could probably go in England, the staunchest defender of British imperialism all over the world. The same was true in France. General de Gaulle founded his own party as a slap in the face to all of the liberal left-wing socialists who let the French army down and denied it the means to modernize and defeat a German attack instead of relying on the Maginot Line, ideas that the generals from World War I believed. Oh, it worked in the last war. The next chapter deals with Spain, and my book on Spain, Spanish vignettes. I said The Left is Seldom Right wasn't the bestseller, but I can boast that my book on Spain, my wife and I lived there for 7 years, was the leading best-selling cultural guidebook to Spain, published in Spain in English. Okay? When you put all those together, I still have the best-selling book. And it's called Franco-Fascism and the Phalange. I've read countless articles and mentions of Franco as an arch-fascist. He belonged to no political party. The Spanish fascist party, the Phalange, at one point tried to assassinate him because he did not want to commit Spain to entry into the war on the German side. Now, he was an autocrat, a monarchist, a devout Catholic, but like in other places in Europe, it was exactly those elements on the right, conservative, Catholic, monarchist, and not, as Hollywood had you believe, always the left, the labor unions. It was these conservative elements that regarded the Nazis as gutter trash. If you've seen either of two great films, the one with Liza Minnelli, Cabaret, there's a great scene where in a park, all of the young people stand up and sing the song, "The future belongs to us," just like many young people. The only ones who don't stand up are the old crippled veterans from the First World War, because they know where those slogans led. And the other film is The Sound of Music. Colonel von Trapp, he opposes the Nazis, who eventually tried to force him to compromise. And the close neighbor, a teenager who's in love with one of his daughters, nevertheless betrays him to the Nazis because he is a patriot. He is a young person who's swayed by Hitler's ideals. The other chapters have to do with Denmark, where I also lived for 7 years. The international brigades. Everyone has heard of the international brigade that rushed to the aid of Republican Spain to fight against Franco and the fascists. And they certainly deserve our admiration, but quite a few of them were such dogmatic communists that when the Soviet Union attacked Finland, and Finnish Americans from Minnesota and Michigan, several hundred of them, rallied to the cause of aiding Finland. They simply got there on the last 2 or 3 days of the war. But imagine leaving the United States in 1940 to go to the far north of Europe and to risk their lives to defend the homeland of their parents and grandparents. The veterans of the Lincoln Brigade, many of whom were communists, put a full-page ad in the New York Times titled, "The Yanks Are Not Coming," criticizing their own fellow Americans who